That's Jefferson with the Declaration in the New York City Hall. This statue was removed. It's no longer there. It's a replica of a similar statue in the US Capitol. So about me, I have two sort of research areas. One is the political thought of the American founding. The other is controversies over executive power. I sort of alternate and go back and forth. What we're going to hear tonight is from a new book that's in press called The Other Declarations, Thomas Jefferson, The Language of American Democracy. My very first book was on Jefferson and executive power. And I have this up here just in order to contextualize what you're going to hear. I've spent 25 years thinking about the American founding, and what I do specifically is try to get as specific as possible with particular founders and particular questions to figure out how far I can push and figure out what we can know about them, rather than starting with, say, a general theory of the American founding and trying to make claims about the American founding. I'm trying to add to our knowledge about founders in a gradual way to create a kind of intellectual map on a variety of questions. And we'll get started. So in the summer of 1824, the poet Lydia Howard Huntley Sigourney sent Jefferson her book-length poem, Traits of the Aborigines, which had been published in 1822. Addressing Jefferson as the sage of Monticello, she explained that the poem was meant to demonstrate the claims of pity and justice held by the native inhabitants of America. She was sending it because she knew that Jefferson shared her interest in what she called the long-forgotten wanderers of our forest, but also because she wanted to express her intellectual debts to Jefferson, whose notes on the state of Virginia was among the originating cause of her deep interest in that unfortunate people. In particular, it was Jefferson's lucid and forcible delineation of the genius of our aborigines that had made an impression on her. Jefferson responded quickly, noting his agreement to her advocacy of Indian rights. But more than that, her poetry was especially needed because it would do better than prose to teach the duties we owe to that race of men. In a striking line, Jefferson wrote that he wished that this was the only blot in our moral history and that no other had higher charges to bring against us. Referring now to slavery, Jefferson repeated a metaphor that he'd used in his now famous letter to Maine Congressman John Holmes when he learned of the Missouri Compromise. He could not see how the country is going to disengage itself from the entanglement of slavery. It was as if they had a wolf by the ears and feel the danger of either holding him or letting him loose. Now, in the same month, Jefferson offered a friendly critique of a correspondent's proposal to create a commune in the Indiana Territory, a commune based on common ownership of property. His critique included a vivid example of a journey by a philosophic observer across North America. The trip would begin with the savages of the Rocky Mountains, his words, and move eastwardly towards the seacoast. This philosophic journey would be equivalent to a survey of human history itself and of the progress of man from the infancy of creation to the present day. First, humans would be living under no law but nature and covering themselves with the flesh and skin of wild beasts. Next, on the frontier, this philosophic traveler would find humans in the pastoral state, where humans raised animals instead of hunting them. After the pastoral state will come our own semi-barbarous citizens who are pioneers in the advance of civilization. From there, human life would be gradually become more civilized until it reached its most improved state in our seaport towns. Now, nearly 5 decades earlier, Jefferson had made similar comments about Native Americans in progress. In a letter to his friend James Madison, he wrote that there are 3 forms of society: those without government, those where the will of everyone has a just influence, and those based on force. He attributed the form without government to our Indians, but importantly wanted to write that as a problem not clear in my mind, that the first condition is not the best. However, even if Indian life without government was the best, it was inconsistent with any degree of population. These statements suggest that even as Jefferson believed that the treatment of native nations was a moral blot on American history, he also believed that native life was primitive and therefore fated by history to disappear. These ideas had consequences. From the perspective of today, we can see that Jefferson's election in 1800 signaled the rise of the rising power of a new political coalition, a coalition that would dominate American politics until 1860. Their success was a victory for ordinary white Americans, especially farmers, and a defeat for elites. It would also appear that the success of Jefferson's political coalition meant that the native inhabitants of North America were doomed. With the rise of Southern and Western power came the rise of a coalition who, unlike Americans in the Northeast, still had a, quote, Indian problem. In 1830, this coalition fundamentally changed Indian policy by passing the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the president, Jackson, to negotiate with tribes for the relocation across the Mississippi. Even though Jefferson and Andrew Jackson were very different on the Indian question, it would not be too far off to ask today whether Jefferson, as both founder and figurehead of the coalition that Jackson would later lead, should share some of the blame for setting in motion the forces of injustice now associated with Jackson. In fact, Jefferson himself invites this accusation in two beautiful paragraphs in his second inaugural address, which I have on your handout and we'll come back to. Now, the language of conquest in the second inaugural is bracing, in part because it so clearly relied on the presumption that Native peoples enjoyed the same natural rights as European and American peoples. But this was not the first time that Jefferson had written of the natural equality of Native Americans. One place to begin is with his notes on the state of Virginia, the 1785 book that had inspired Lydia Howard Huntley. Jefferson wrote that book in answer to a series of questions from a French diplomat. This was standard Jeffersonian activity. The American poster child for the Enlightenment was the son of a mapmaker, and he spent a considerable portion of his life taking measurements of the natural world. The book is filled with descriptions of rivers and caves and climate. But more than simply describing the New World, the book was also a defense of animal life in North America. For Jefferson saw it as an opportunity to defend the New World from a leading scientific theory coming out of the French Enlightenment. According to this theory, the New World was inferior in every way. Specifically, because the New World was more humid than the Old World, the animals in the New World were weaker, smaller, and less reproductive. As a result, humans in North America were similarly inferior to their European counterparts. Jefferson just saw the book as a chance not only to present data about the New World, but also as a platform by which he could undercut the conventional wisdom that the Old World was superior by nature. Because the philosophers of the Old World believed that nature had enlisted herself as a cis or transatlantic partisan, Jefferson had to defend North America against bad science. Now, his defense of North America included a defense of its indigenous peoples. Based on his observations, the American Indians were neither weak nor impotent. In his view, many of their characteristics were the product of convention, not nature. For example, the men had small hands and wrists because they did not do menial labor, and they had less facial hair because they plucked it. The women were stronger than ours and even participated in making war. As a result, they had fewer children, not because they were less fertile, but because they practiced abortion. In this account of Indian life, Jefferson also praised the intellectual ability of the native inhabitants of North America. For readers of the notes, this is particularly memorable because of its contrast with the passages on the enslaved black people he observed in Virginia. In contrast to those black Americans, Jefferson concluded that Indians are equal in mind as well as in body. To make this case, Jefferson praised their eminence in oratory, which was paltry compared to their multiplied proofs of their bravery and address in war. To be sure, this eminence could be appreciated especially in the superior luster of a few individuals, and he pointed to a speech by a Mingo chief, Tachnodorus, known to Jefferson and his readers as Logan, as an example of Indian eloquence. This is Logan. Logan's speech was actually a message delivered to the colonial governor in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, in 1774, at the conclusion of Lord Dunmore's War, a conflict between the Shawnee and Virginians in western Pennsylvania. The conflict was precipitated by a massacre of Logan's family, including Logan's wife and sister, who were guests at an encampment of white Virginians. Logan's message was delivered by way of General John Gibson, who fought against the Indians, but who also happened to be Logan's brother-in-law. Logan's sister and Gibson's wife was pregnant, and her unborn baby cut from her womb and impaled on a stake. In revenge, Logan and his men scalped 13 white settlers, causing panic in the region and the evacuation of hundreds of more white settlers. At the Battle of Point Pleasant, the Shawnee were defeated and agreed to forfeit land claims to Kentucky. Logan did not attend the treaty negotiation, and so his message was meant to assure Dunmore that Logan no longer considered himself at war. Jefferson included the full text of Logan's address, concluding that it was superior to any speech coming out of Europe, including the whole orations of Demosthenes and Cicero. As a result of Jefferson's praise, Logan's speech became famous and was included in American textbooks on rhetoric. Frederick Douglass, for example, would have read it and practiced from it. The speech also attracted critics in Jefferson's day and soon became entangled in partisan politics. Jefferson spent considerable effort over the next 2 decades trying to demonstrate its authenticity. There's some question about how Jefferson acquired the speech in the first place. It is possible, for example, that his friend, James Madison, actually discovered it. Now, Jefferson's high-flown treatment of Logan's address is a bit puzzling. Consider, for example, Jefferson's closest political ally, Madison. In his letter to a publisher, Madison explained that Logan's speech was a specimen of Indian eloquence and of mistaken valor that had not yet appeared in print. He also apologized for the unskillfulness of the interpreter. By contrast, Jefferson offered Logan's speech in the notes to challenge the whole orations of Demosthenes and Cicero and of any more eminent orator, daring readers to show that Europe has finished a single passage superior to the speech of Logan, a Mingo chief. Now, it is true that Jefferson was sometimes guilty of hyperbole, but this seems a bit much. Likewise, what explains his labored forensic defense of the speech against critics who question its authenticity? However true it may be that the Indian in North America displays an innate moral sense and was just as strong and as reproductive as Europeans, is it also true that Logan's speech is the superior of Cicero, or Shakespeare for that matter? And what did Jefferson see in Logan's valor that his contemporaries and his friend, James Madison, did not? Now, I believe some clue to these questions can be found in the Second Inaugural. In that address, Jefferson offered commiseration for the aboriginal inhabitants who had been overwhelmed by a current of invaders from abroad. I mentioned to Taylor today that this passage was pointed out to me for the first time by Diane Shaw, who will be here later in the spring. This was back in 2006 when I was sitting on a class she was leading for high school teachers. Overwhelmed by a current of invaders from abroad, invaders who saw Indian land as empty land, needing to be appropriated and developed. In these few short sentences, we see that for Jefferson, the first president to speak on such things, there's no doubt that the encounter was closer to injustice than it was to justice. To borrow a famous line from the Federalist, the whole affair was more like government by accident and force than by reflection and choice. But that was not all. Under the circumstances, the only course remaining was assimilation. It turns out that that path, assimilation, was not so bad because it's also the path of enlightenment. Science can liberate the Indians no less than it can the Anglo-Americans. And neither Europeans nor Indians have to remain as their creator made them. By way of assimilation, native peoples too can master nature and make it theirs, and thereby join Anglo-Americans in this common project of humanity. Now, you might be asking, does not Jefferson's pivot from the injustice of the history to the necessity of assimilation as the only path forward merit some skepticism, not only about Jefferson, but also about assimilation as a policy? Now, I'll summarize the talk here, and I'll say, we can talk about this in the questions and answers. I don't presume that assimilation is simply a pretext for conquest and disposition. Rather, in the mind of its architects, it was meant to be a noble and philosophical alternative to conquest, which was the period beforehand. The document that lays this out most clearly is a document from Secretary of War Henry Knox to George Washington, addressing a problem on the sort of south of Georgia, dealing with Alexander McIlvaray and his possible threats to build a credible creek threat to the United States. And the contours of the policies, it would require clarity about who owned what, justly. This is why, for example, Jefferson and others created the Federal Land Office in the 1790s. And it would require clarity about native ownership of land and enforcement of that clarity. It would also rely on missionaries to demonstrate goodwill. And it would need something like a standing army. I think Knox says 1,500 men, something that, of course, Washington was unwilling to provide. Now, to summarize then, again, which we can discuss later, is that Jefferson's language of commiseration for the aboriginal inhabitants in the Second Inaugural fit a widely held view that assimilation was an enlightened alternative to conquest. In this case, conquest at the hands of ungovernable settler whites. Washington calls them a tribe of banditti. This is to say that assimilation as a policy, at least in the self-understanding of its architects, was not simply a cover for removal and dispossession. That being said, it was also a spectacular failure. There are several causes for this failure. These include rival and irreconcilable philosophies of punishment between Indians and white settlers on the frontier, the emergence of mixed-race Indian leaders who crossed between worlds and often sold native lands for personal gain and almost always died in a ditch somewhere, The unending confusion about who held authority, both among Americans and among Native nations, federalism, etc. And finally, the periodic flowering of nativist renaissance, in which assimilation was rejected on its face. More on that later. Above all else, assimilation was doomed because its architects lacked the political will and the military capacity to prevent white settlers from encroaching on Indian lands. Or in other words, the U.S. could not and would not control its western and southern borders. But Jefferson was somewhat more Machiavellian than other presidents in this period. In an 18 letter to the governor of Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, yes, from Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Jefferson provided what he called an extensive view of our Indian policy. The overall goal was perpetual peace with the Indians, and to get there by everything we could do, just and liberal we can do for them within the bounds of reason. But because the decrease of game would make hunting insufficient as a way to maintain subsistence, this peace would necessarily have to include a change of the Indian way of life. In short, he says, we wish to draw them to agriculture, to spinning and weaving. Once Indians accepted agriculture, they would have no need for their extensive forest, and likely would be willing to sell them in order to purchase the necessaries for their farms and families. This was not all. Jefferson advised Harrison to push our trading houses. The federal government could sell at cost, while private merchants could not, which meant that the federal government could establish a monopoly on trade. This would serve two purposes. First, it would improve relations, as transactions between Native Americans and government officials is likely to be better for mutual relations than transactions between Native Americans and private individuals. Second, the government could take advantage of Native leaders. Ideally, good and influential individuals among them would run into debt and then sell their lands to the U.S. government. The goal would be to have American settlements gradually circumscribe and approach the Indians, so they'd have no choice but to either incorporate with us as citizens of the United States or remove beyond the Mississippi. Jefferson preferred the first option, that Native Americans become citizens, but he saw this would require a Machiavellian understanding of both fear and love. For Indians to choose to become citizens, the Americans would have to cultivate their love. But the Americans would also have to appeal to their fear by showing Native nations that their liberality was a feature of humanity, not weakness, and that the Americans would only have to shut our hand to crush them. It is telling that this is one of the very few occasions when Jefferson referred to Machiavelli. Now, the letter to Harrison was unusually frank, but Jefferson gave similar instructions to others charged with executing his policy. The common idea was the following: use a small military presence to keep the peace among tribes and between tribes and frontier whites, and to discourage mischief by European powers. Negotiate with duly constituted authorities to acquire Indian land, while at the same time encouraging Indians to give up hunting and take up farming. Use trading houses to entice leaders to undertake personal debt, and then offer to purchase those lands as a way to settle those debts. And then fight, defeat, and remove Indians who refuse to honor American laws governing lands already acquired from Native nations. Jefferson changed course a few months later when he learned of the Louisiana Purchase in July of 1803. Now, to step back for a second here, Jefferson believed that Louisiana Purchase was unconstitutional. It was unconstitutional because it doubled the size of the United States, and he thought that was a bit much. And more importantly, Napoleon insisted on a provision in the Louisiana Treaty that required incorporation of the inhabitants of Louisiana into citizenship as soon as possible. There are all sorts of complexities in Louisiana and New Orleans regarding race, slavery, religion that made this immediate incorporation especially tricky for Americans. So Jefferson believed better to err on the side of constitutional propriety and get an amendment. He did not get that amendment. And scholars have spent over 100 years thinking about that in the context of Jefferson and executive power. That was a central part of my first book. I'm ashamed to say when I wrote that book, I did not bother to notice that the vast majority of the text of Jefferson's Louisiana Amendment had to do with native land claims. And so when I came back to this project, I noticed that and I thought, this is really interesting. What exactly is he trying to do with the actual words of the amendment? And so you see in this July draft, the amendment would constitutionalize rights of occupancy in the soil and of self-government. The September draft would have blocked off the vast majority, that is from the Louisiana-Arkansas border north to Montana, from white settlement, specifically would have required a future constitutional amendment for any statehood. In other words, no Missouri Compromise, which is amazing to think about, had Jefferson got his amendment, which he did not. Now, Jefferson famously chooses silence. In September, he backs away from a constitutional amendment. That's a complicated question. I took that up in my first book. We could talk about that in questions and answers. Now, my argument tonight, it was in this context, the acquisition of Louisiana and the failure to procure a Louisiana amendment, which would have provided what he called a happy asylum for Native nations, in which Jefferson gave his second inaugural. An early outline of that address reveals that Jefferson originally intended to include a section discussing philosophy. Jefferson seems to have changed the section on philosophy into a section on Indians sometime between his first drafts and the draft he sent Madison in early February. He delivered it in early March. It is in this passage on the aboriginal inhabitants of North America where Jefferson turns from reporting his administration's accomplishments to offering a lesson on the requirements of free government. This lesson begins with a lesson on Native experience, a lesson in history that requires nothing less than recognition that Jefferson and his predecessors had acted on the side of injustice, not justice. Again, Jefferson went so far as to acknowledge the United States came into being as part of an invading current from Europe into North America, a current that was driving Native inhabitants into oblivion. Now, if the dilemma facing America's aboriginal inhabitants was unjust, it was also somewhat paradoxically foreordained by the forces unleashed by the Enlightenment. These men and women, like any other, will need to exercise their reason, follow its dictates, and change their pursuits with the change of circumstances. The obstacles to this were the usual culprits: habit, prejudice, ignorance, pride, but they also included interested and crafty individuals among them. In an extraordinary passage, Jefferson wanted to explain that these men were anti-philosophist. Volumes usually say anti-philosophers. That's a textual error. It's anti-philosophist. Who wanted to inculcate a sanctimonious reverence for the customs of their ancestors by teaching that reason is a false guide, that people have a duty to remain as their Creator made them. If these leaders had their way, they would maintain the ascendancy of habit over the duty of improving our reason. Now, in his notes for the address, Jefferson explained that this passage was written to avoid direct warfare on bigotry and despotism, and instead would covertly hit its mark by inference and general extension. Thus, the section on philosophy became a section on Indians, and both were linked by the anti-philosophist, elites whose political and economic interest motivated them to use appeals to ancestral custom to hold back the forces of enlightenment. Jefferson's audience, both Federalists and Republicans, made the connection. For example, a correspondent to Connecticut's True Republican newspaper noted that the remarks with respect to the aboriginal inhabitants compares very exactly with the state of the Federal Party in Connecticut. On the other side of the party aisle, Hamilton's New York Evening Post labeled the reference to steady habits quite a hit, indeed a palpable hit, and called the passage on Native Americans a fine stroke of satire on the Federal Party. More than that, that writer noted that Jefferson had neglected to include the country's use of missionaries as part of the project of assimilation. Missionaries have been a key ingredient in the Washington and Knox strategy. According to this critic, Jefferson erred by not looking to Christianity for a solution and instead, tellingly, looked beyond religion itself, relying altogether on the exercise of reason, the philosophist God. Now, given the history and the reality that hunting lands would eventually disappear, for Jefferson, the only remaining option was assimilation. Read in the context of the failed Louisiana Amendment, Jefferson's statement of commiseration could be read as an acknowledgement that he and others who wanted to do right by Native nations had just missed their last opportunity. These liberty-loving men and women would now be reduced within limits too narrow for the hunter state, and would therefore have to exchange their culture for another. Paradoxically, from the perspective of enlightenment, this was natural, but from the perspective of natural rights, this was an act of injustice. Now, there's less paradox in the fact that certain Native leaders presented a real problem for Jefferson and its goals for assimilation. His language treating the anti-philosophist was no doubt influenced by, and this is a new contribution, no doubt influenced by Constantine Volney's view of the climate and soil of the United States of America, published in France and then in England in 1804. Jefferson wrote Volney a long letter praising the book on February 8th That is precisely when he was writing the Second Inaugural. In a portion of the book, based on interviews with the Miami chief Little Turtle, Volney reported that there was an internal disagreement among Indians about the desirability of progress. Here's Volney. In all these tribes, there's a generation of old warriors who, when they see a man handling the hoe, are incessantly exclaiming against the degeneracy from ancient manners, and who pretend that the decline of the savages is entirely owing to these innovations, and that to recover their ancient strength and ancient glory, nothing is necessary but a return to their primitive manners. Now, what Volney was describing was a recurring pattern in the encounter between native nations and early Americans, a pattern of nativist renaissance that stood in the way of assimilation. Again and again, a leader would emerge, often claiming a special dispensation by way of a religious experience, a vision, a miracle, a prediction of a lunar eclipse, etc., etc. This leader would then call for a return of native identity and rejection of assimilation. Jefferson and then Madison would confront this problem in the person of Little Turtle, and then again later Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa. Notably, Jefferson drew from Volney's language, but he attributed a motive to Volney's older generation who resisted innovation. These men had an interest in the present order of things, and so they worked against any change that threatened it. The threat, as depicted by Jefferson, was reason itself, for these anti-philosophists taught that reason is a false guide and led to perilous innovation. Reason was also impious, as their duty was to remain as their Creator made them, ignorance being safety and knowledgeful of danger. Here, Jefferson returned to language he had borrowed from David Williams's claims of literature. Another part of the book, I show how this work influenced Jefferson's turn on the meaning of a free press, this book by David Williams. So here again, Jefferson returned to language he had borrowed from David Williams' claims of literature and had used elsewhere in the address to think through the case for the freedom of the press. Jefferson wrote that the action and counteraction of good sense and bigotry, this is Williams' words, was evident among these men. In this, the passage on speech and inquiry is crucial to progress, found its way to the section on Indians and not in the section on the freedom of the press, as was originally planned. This makes sense, given that the original plan for the section on Indians was to be a section on philosophy. As he had done with the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson drafted a version of the address and a special shorthand to deliver it. This so-called reading copy not only condensed the text onto a single piece of paper, but also provided notations for how the address was meant to be read. These included notations of short and long pauses, as well as what the Jefferson paper's editors conclude are likely longer emphatical breaks. Jefferson relied on these longer breaks, indicated by a dagger, less frequently in the first half of the address than he did in the more ambitious and more philosophic part of the address on Native Americans and the press. In particular, Jefferson employed a dramatic pause both before and after the clause that reason is a false guide, and to advance its counsel in their physical, moral, or political condition is perilous innovation. He also used a dramatic pause after accusing the anti-philosophist of having an interest in keeping things in their present state. Jefferson's audience then would have heard his emphasis on the attack on the enemies of enlightenment. Now, Jefferson's condemnation of elites opposed to enlightenment was no doubt the intended object of this part of the address, but it is nonetheless striking that Jefferson set it up by writing a no less memorable passage on the injustice of the history of the aboriginal inhabitants of North America. No such passage, for example, occurs in Volney's account of native life. In contrast, Volney wrote that no right of property exists among the savages. And according to Volney, who was responding to Rousseau's second discourse, the American Indian was still a savage. Compared to the Arabian shepherd, Volney says, who has been fitted for social and familial life and honors the rights of property, the American Indian is a hunter and butcher who has acquired a roaming, wasteful, and ferocious disposition. Similar in kind with the wolf and tiger, the American Indian can unite in bands or troops, but not in organized societies. Because of the excessive independence of each member, Indian politics, again, this is Volney, is a turbulent and terrorist democracy, a real and fearful anarchy. So even though Jefferson borrowed from Volney, he did not reproduce Volney's description of savage Indian life. Indeed, Jefferson's commiseration for the aboriginal inhabitants of North America is notable for its lack of emphasis on their ferocity. Strangely, Jefferson does not seem to consider the possibility that native resistance to assimilation is motivated by what the ancient Greeks called thumos, or spiritedness, which is a combination of righteous anger and a desire for glory. In other words, Jefferson, apparently following Madison's suggested edits, treated resistance to assimilation as necessarily petty and self-interested, that is, as corrupt. The Anti-Federalists, again, had an unseemly interest in keeping things in their present state. But what if the motivation was simply the more basic urge not to be dominated by someone else? This point, after all, is made by Tocqueville in his chapter on the three races that inhabit the territory of the United States. As he saw it, the Native American saw white civilization as dishonorable. He attaches barbarism as a sign of his race, and because his pride chooses death over intermingling with the European. In fact, Jefferson had made this very point in the Notes on the State of Virginia. There he wrote that the Indian of North America is brave when enterprise depends on bravery, and he'll defend himself against a host of enemies, always choosing to be killed rather than to surrender, though it be to the whites who he knows will treat him well. It is curious, therefore, that the Second Inaugural is silent on this part of the history in question. Or to put it differently, there is no Chief Logan here. Now, Jefferson would soon become familiar with the most famous of nativist Renaissance leaders, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, otherwise known as the Prophet, whose rise no doubt had to do with the pressure on native nations caused by the Louisiana Purchase. Tenskwatawa called for a revival of ancient Indian customs. He began his program with an execution of witches, including Christian converts. In 1807, this had the additional complication that Americans perceived that war with Great Britain was imminent. In the beginning, it appears that Jefferson believed the Prophet would likely be handled by other Indians or perhaps could be bought off. After all, he was simply a scoundrel who only needs his price. But Jefferson changed his mind. In 1808, he wrote that he was now satisfied that he had the true understanding of the Prophet, as he now saw that the Prophet was an enthusiast of the ancient habits, customs, and superstitions of their fathers. His object was to get them back to their former mode of life and to reject everything leading to civilization, to intercourse or incorporation with the whites. Later, to John Adams, Jefferson noted that the Prophet had become a proper subject of inquiry for me, an inquiry made with great diligence. Jefferson found that the Prophet pretended to be in constant communication with the Great Spirit, and that the Great Spirit had told him that the Indians were created by him, that is, the Great Spirit, distinct from whites, of different natures, for different purposes, and placed under the opinions of their forefathers. Thus, the Prophet urged Indians to abstain alcohol, gunpowder, and wheat. Jefferson went on to say that he concluded from all this that the Prophet was a visionary, enveloped in the clouds of their antiquities, and vainly endeavoring to lead back his brethren to the fancied beatitudes of their golden age. In 1811, the Prophet ordered a preemptive defensive attack on William Henry Harrison and his force of about 1,000 soldiers who had marched to the headquarters of the Confederacy assembled by the Prophet in Tecumseh. Native forces were defeated at the Battle of Tippecanoe, Prophetstown was burned to the ground, and Tenskwatawa fled to Canada. Tecumseh was away at the time, but he was killed at the Battle of Thames in 1813, and Tenskwatawa died in Kansas City a decade later. Now that we've considered the broad sweep of Jefferson's political thought with regard to the native question, we can now return to the puzzle of Logan's address. What did Jefferson see in that speech that made it so worthy of American admiration? One potential explanation is that Jefferson praised Logan because Logan was willing to fight. Unlike those who cower at oppression, those people who are more disposed to suffer, as the Declaration of Independence puts it, Logan took up arms and was successful in killing his enemies. It is for this willingness to fight that the great historian Peter Onuf likens Logan to the citizen soldier, a model of Jeffersonian republicanism, where each man is willing to take up arms and defend his nation. By this view, Logan's speech is eloquent only because of the action on which it rested. Another possibility is that Jefferson did not see Logan the same way as he saw Tecumseh or Tenskwatawa. For these leaders, native identity and native land claims were necessarily entangled in religious belief. Unlike these religious leaders, Logan's self-presentation was based on a straightforward vision of justice, based on a repayment of a harm that is owed. Logan did not invoke divinity, but instead explained that he had sought and achieved his desire for vengeance. With the rhetorical similarity to passages from the Gospel of Matthew, there is perhaps an appeal to Christian ethics, but there's no mention of Jesus. In other words, Logan's independence does not require religious backing. But these explanations can only go so far. Logan gave the speech in order to assure the British that he was satisfied and would no longer seek war, even though he would not participate in the request for peace by his defeated Indian countrymen. He would honor it, not out of fear of British military power, but rather as a man who no longer needed to fight. It is therefore curious that Logan spoke of his country but his stated calculations are only about himself. It is possible that Logan's solitary self-understanding was the better alternative in Jefferson's view, at least in the context of the Shawnee, for it appears that in the 1780s, Jefferson believed that the Shawnee would never be peaceful neighbors. Whatever the case, it appears that Logan is attractive because he bravely fights, but this also must mean that he's unattractive because he fights only for himself. Logan appears to be a solitary actor, looking out only for Logan alone. Likewise, as Jefferson must have noted, Logan did not offer himself as a model of assimilation. On that score, he was a distinguished chief who saw himself as both part of a country and as an advocate for peace. But the nature and purpose of his peace was elusive. And from Jefferson's 1775 memorandum book, we learn that Logan might have noted that his countrymen had hooted at him for his love of white people. Further, there's evidence that Logan delivered his message in June 1774, which opens the possibility that Logan was in fact offering a separate peace months before his countrymen were defeated at the Battle of Point Pleasant. More broadly, Jefferson never offers evidence that Logan favored progress or was amenable to science. Finally, it is possible that Jefferson did not believe his praise. And there's some evidence that he at least changed his mind about Logan later in life. In a letter that has not received any attention to my knowledge, Jefferson referred to Native Americans, or compared Native Americans to the ancient Spartans. Of the latter, the Spartans, he expressed astonishment at how such a tribe of savages ever acquired the admiration of the world. He wanted to write that Logan, Tecumseh, and Little Turtle were fair parallels to Spartan leaders Brasidas and Agesilaus. For the Spartans, and by extension American Indians, the difficulties to conceive that such a horde of barbarians could so long remain unimproved in the neighborhood of a people so polished as the Athenians. Their fame, that is the Spartans, was only a matter of their connection to a more civilized people, and their virtue was just that they were as brave as bulldogs. Logan and Tecumseh were eloquent and brave, but they were unenlightened. It's also worth pointing out that unlike Logan, Tecumseh was a potential founder. Consider the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. As scholars have noted, the first paragraph asserts that one people need to declare the causes when they decide to separate themselves from another. But it never explains the process by which a people becomes a separate people in the first place. Or as Jim Caesar put it, the first paragraph is under-theorized. How does one people become two? It never explains that. The historian Brian Steele has shown that to solve this puzzle, we have to look elsewhere, specifically the Summary View of the Rights of British America for Jefferson's own solution to this puzzle. In that document, Jefferson linked the settling of North America to the settling of England. Just as the English built a nation in the wilds of America, their Saxon ancestors had left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe, had possessed themselves of the island of Britain, then less charged with inhabitants, and established there that system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country. These Saxon immigrants, like the British settlers of North America, were acting under a right which nature has given to all men, namely the right of departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them, and of going in quest of new habitations, and of there establishing new societies under such laws and regulations as to them shall most likely promote the public happiness. What we see in this extraordinary passage is that Britain and America had similar foundings, and that both arose from the exercise of natural right. This exercise had two components, choice and creation. Choice is instantiated in the act of immigration, and creation in the act of settlement and lawmaking. What is worth noticing is that Jefferson goes out of his way to notice that choice and creation are done by individuals. It was the blood and fortune, he says, spent by particular persons who decided the effort was worth their while. America was conquered, he writes, and her settlements made and firmly established at the expense of individuals and not of the British public. It is impossible to miss the fact that Jefferson's summary view stipulates that America was conquered by settlers from Britain. This step in the logic of the summary view is all the more important when considered next to the rationale for Jefferson's commiseration in the Second Inaugural. There, he explains that the aboriginal inhabitants possessed natural rights, both natural rights, and a love for liberty, combining to a wish to be left alone. But these people who Jefferson calls inhabitants only occupied the land, what Jefferson calls these countries. They did not settle it, and they did not make these countries one. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So yeah, we'll take questions. at least for a little bit. Any questions? I'll ask one if you want to get started. I'll get started. So I'm always wary of, I mean, like, I think it's like a noble exercise to try to understand, like, what the words say and what they were up to in this project. But it always strikes me that it's useful to leave open the possibility that they were sort of doing their own kind of politics, that they didn't always, like these founders, that Jefferson, I mean, even like the most famous ones, I think, were most susceptible to this, that they were writing for history, and they knew it, right? Madison, I think, famously maybe knew it, and that, like, what are we to make of, like, the actual words in light of that? I mean, what if we wanted to step back and say, like, what is the veracity with which they actually mean these things, rather than, you know, whether it's writing for history or kind of doing an internal politics?
Yeah, so I wrestled with this in the Madison book, in part because there's a famous two Madisons problem that scholars have talked about, Gordon Wood famously so, a Madison in the 1780s and a Madison in the 1790s, and trying to figure that out. So that book wrestled with that, and one question is surely change is possible, right? Surely Madison changed his mind, I think. So it's an issue. For your question here, I think Jefferson in a way is distinctive. He preserved every single letter, which is why the editors of the Jefferson papers started their project in 1950, and they're still not finished. And he invented a device to have his outbox saved in addition to his inbox. And so with Madison, for example, it's frustrating. There are all these incredible exchanges where I don't have Madison's reply. Like all these smoking gun questions like, Madison, do you believe representatives will actually be truly representative? Here's why I think not. And there's no reply. I don't know if Madison replied and was lost or not. With Jefferson, that's not the case, because he recorded the outbox. And I'll push even further, and that's the exception, of course, is his correspondence with his wife, which he destroyed. But with Jefferson, the reason why we know of his lies, the reason why we know of his deceptions, is because he and only he saved them. And so he presents I think, an interesting case in the sense that you have this correspondence. Now, he presents other interpretive problems. He doesn't love conflict, and so he writes differently to different correspondents. He has this talent with his felicitous writing style, famously, which sometimes gets in the way and he gets carried away with. You know, the earth belongs to the living, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to, use judgment and not over-interpreting a single passage here and there. I'm leaning too heavily on it, and you need to, sort of have a theory about how it sort of adds up, for sure. I had somebody email me if Jefferson ever said that, like Locke did, that the legislative branch was naturally supreme in a republic. And then did he ever say that after the U.S. Constitution was ratified in the context of Congress? So I said I'm agnostic on both. I'm less agnostic on the second question. There's probably an outlier somewhere. And you have to weigh that outlier against the body of the evidence pointing the other way. And that's a kind of inelegant fact of doing this kind of work.
Some questions. I was struck as you were going through this, just how much it sounded like, just as I read through these passages that we have up there, how much it seems like Jefferson is involved. I mean, he seems to be, maybe this goes to your question too, Tom, he seems to be using Logan as a kind of foil. Like this is here, and then also just other statements he makes on various native chiefs. He seems to be using them as a foil, using Enlightenment language, using what he understands of history, thinking about Athens versus Sparta, and as a way of articulating through practical politics the preconditions for joining or becoming a member of this new enterprise, right? Um, Especially the juxtaposition of Athens and Sparta, because he seems to be, you could say a lot of the critiques here, right, sound like things that I read in Aristotle, Plato, critiques of public use of reason, excessive innovation, right? So I'm wondering, just in the context of Jefferson's oeuvre as
Yeah, so
how is he thinking about technology, innovation? I mean, he's using a sort of inveterate, kind of almost religious anti-reason, but that's not a clear representative of the ancient position of Athens, but he's pro-Athens on some levels.
Yeah, so the remark on Athens and Sparta is very unusual for Jefferson. He rarely refers to Athens and Sparta, and when he does, he's usually contemptuous and dismissive. He hates Plato because he hates Platonism, which he thinks has been corrupted by Christianity, so he has this really sort of dismissive view. And so if you're trying to get a fair reading of antiquity, Jefferson's not your guy. It's just not it. And he is, three greatest men who ever lived, without exception: Bacon, Newton, and Locke, all English rationalists, all scientists, right? And so that's just the way he sees the world. And so I'm not. I mean, the only reason why I mentioned that letter, it's never really been commented on before, and it does show that there's some maybe lack of sincerity about his earlier praise of Logan. Perhaps that's an explanation, and so that's why I feel compelled to, to bring it to the reader's attention, right? Why Logan? By the way, I'm open to suggestions of what's attractive about Logan's speech. So if there's something that the audience sees in Logan's speech that is worth praise, I'm curious. I've given a version of this talk maybe like 15 places, and I'm curious to hear what the audience sees in Logan's address. He gave it so much attention, and then literally it became an object of contestation during the election of 1800. Like one of these things, like the dossier or the laptop or something, that had to be resolved by the newspapers and investigation, and people giving affidavits and testimony about the authenticity of this address. And at some point, Jefferson had to defend himself from charges that he invented it. And actually, his statement on it is kind of weird because he leaves open the possibility that he did, which is another sort of classic Jefferson thing. Even if I were the author of it, it would not affect the central premise that North American genius is the equivalent of European genius. Something to that effect. All right.
So I mean, since you mentioned reactions to Logan's speech, I think you briefly touched on this, but the beginning he says, if any white man ever entered Logan's cabin hungry, it never happened that he gave him not meat. If ever he came cold and naked, he clothed him not. And then the countryman pointing as he's passing, and I'm wondering. These seem like distant sort of biblical allusions potentially to the parable of sheep and the goats and the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yes, the Gospel of Matthew, is that where?
Yeah.
So
I'm guessing, is that part of, but then what's interesting is...
So some scholars have questioned the authenticity of the address. In other words, on the grounds that no native would have appealed to the Gospel of Matthew to make this claim. So it's an invention by some white interpreter. That is, you see that in some of the literature, particularly from native scholars today. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. I don't know if there was a. Yeah.
Well, no.
Yeah,
I mean, what's striking is there's all this possible biblical imagery, being an advocate for peace, and then you get a quite striking turn. Right, that this called on me for revenge. I've sought it. I've killed many. I've fully glutted my vengeance. And that's maybe not what people would have been expecting. And I wonder whether, just since you're asking us to think about what's striking about the speech. That's one of the things that's striking about it to me.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to praise in 1785. The revolution is over. If anything, we're getting close to the analysis of the articles that something's very wrong. But so it's hard to figure out like why Jefferson would have a reason to insist. And then if you've ever taught this text, it's really difficult in the classroom because it compares against his complete dismissal of Felix Whitley and others on the grounds that black poetry is totally inferior. And so Logan is great, but these black Americans have no intellectual talent, as Jefferson concludes, at least tentatively in the notes. And so the elevation of native ability and the dismissal of black ability is really a challenging thing to work through in the classroom. And why Jefferson would make the example based on observations of enslaved people that he sees. There are, after all, about 12,000 free black people in the Richmond area at the time. And he doesn't base his observations on those people. Rather, he does it on enslaved people. Yeah.
I mean, I'll say it doesn't, without being an expert remotely, it doesn't strike me as odd at all that like he would sort of have this view that maybe is contradictory, and that like I feel like part of what brings the revolution about is a concern over how Western settlement will be handled, and the Americans have one idea, and their idea prevails, and it ends the British Empire on the continent. And now, with the Americans in charge, they are worried about their own empire being ended. And there's a kind of uneasiness about that.
Yeah. So.
And those same threats exist.
Yeah. So say more about why that's the cause of the revolution, or.
Of course,
yeah.
Anything has many causes, but I think that like the British didn't want the Americans moving west and upsetting their relations with tribes farther west, and the Americans didn't. One of the things that they didn't like about the British was that policy.
Yeah. The great Colin Galloway makes this point in The Indian World of George Washington, which is a terrific book, and he points out that basically the proclamation, the Royal Proclamation, which set the line beyond settlement, was terrible for people like Washington because the litigation regime was risky enough where he wouldn't want to get involved in it, but sort of ordinary settler whites didn't care one way or another. So it basically opened up settlement for one kind of Americans and prevented settlement from Americans like Washington. So there's certainly something to that. I don't know. I don't think that. The interest in Logan in 17 is he's trying to defend North America genius. The denigration of black genius comes about because he's trying to explain why emancipation. It's in the context of explaining his bill for gradual emancipation and mandatory relocation. And so he's trying to explain why mandatory relocation is possible. And then it just turns into this long discussion on black inequality, or the lack of black equality. And it turns out, this is another part of the book, not only is Louisiana a potential happy asylum for Native nations, it's also a potential solution to a post-emancipation world. And there are all sorts of people writing Jefferson as early as 1800 saying, hey, look, let's get the Louisiana Territory. Let's begin this project of gradual emancipation, which you supported in the 1780s. And now we have a place for gradual emancipation to work, and that's going to be somewhere in Louisiana. And so the Louisiana Territory becomes a possible solution to two serious problems of justice, the Native question and slavery. And of course, it ultimately becomes neither. Which is a great tragedy.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can speak a bit more sort of to what drew to this question, given the whole range of questions that I asked about this area and literature. And also if you see a particular implication. I hear you talking about how it might have shaped constitutional history, how these amendments passed, or sort of how it shaped views on Louisiana Purchase. And so I'm curious about both your own context and how you see this fitting into the larger.
So why this question as opposed to others? Yeah, so well, I have a biographical answer to that question. And the biographical answer is I was at a week-long workshop in 2010 among historians of the early republic, people studying political thought of the early republic. It was in Santa Fe. And after a day or so, I asked if everybody in the room could explain native policy and what went wrong with assimilation in the early republic, and nobody could. And they could do something on slavery, they could do something on foreign policy, they could do something on religious liberty, they could do something on the tariff, they could do something else on a standing army. But nobody could do that, and that confused me. And then later I learned it has something to do with the way U.S. history departments are organized, and in many state research universities. That field is sort of separate in some way, unfortunately. But I also realized that I was woefully ignorant on the question, so I began trying to understand it. And that led me to this embarrassing fact that I spent a lot of time thinking about the Louisiana Amendment and never really thinking that from Jefferson's perspective, this was also a solution to a problem that Washington, Adams, and Jefferson had been trying to figure out up to that point. And the Louisiana moment, which is this vast amount of land they did not expect, prevented a possible alternative. A second way to answer your question is, again, I'm trying to understand the political thought of Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. Those are my three people, and I'm breaking it up in bite-sized pieces that are manageable, and that when I finish with them, I believe that I have gotten close to what a scholarly account of that information can be, and welcome future scholars to refine and correct that. And so that's one reason for doing it. So it's, again, there's a big scholarly controversy on Jefferson on a free press. I've spent quite a bit of time now thinking about that. I think I've settled it, but we'll see. By the way, nobody's asked about it. I want to point something out. This only happened because a speaker at the University of Oklahoma pointed out something. This was somebody who works in native law, or Indian law as they call it, in the early republic that I had no idea was going on, and it really blew my mind once I saw it, and that is, in this period, there's a movement from the right of soil, that means you own the land, to the right of occupancy. And so roughly in the context of, say, Henry Knox's advice to Washington, the assumption is that native nations had a right to the soil. They own the land, if they owned it. Occupancy meant some sort of temporary arrangement, they had a right to be there, but it didn't necessarily project into the future. And so by the time of McIntosh versus Johnson, the Marshall Court, we get that new view of let's say, native land rights. Jefferson just puts them both together as if they're the same thing. Occupancy and soil. Why is that? Well, one reason. This is another letter that's not really gotten much attention. This is a late redo of his famous letter to James Madison that the earth belongs to the living. This is expected to be taken and published around the country, and it is. Many of Jefferson's letters are written, again, this is another answer to your question. Many of the things that I'm working with in this period were intended to be public documents, and he had a strategy for using them, and so you have to think about what that strategy is, right? In short, nobody has the right to soil. We all have the rights to occupancy, and that's it. Which makes Jefferson particularly odd. There is no natural right to inheritance. Inheritance is simply a feature of convention, of civil rights, not of natural right. And so that makes him very different on these questions. And it also, I think, helps us understand, his confusion over exactly what would be granted to native nations, especially under the assumption that they would all eventually put away, as we all will put away, custom and move towards reason. Right.
One more question. Or are you raising your hand?
Yeah, it was.
Okay, one more question.
Is he reflecting here? This is a remarkable passage. Is he reflecting here Locke's critique of patriarchia? Like, where is this coming from? How does he envision like I die and people just stake a claim on that land? Or what?
Well,
It's a very strange.
civil society can sort it out, but there's no natural right.
So it could be a positive.
Yeah, it could be a positive right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's likely going to be because you're going to need to for a variety of reasons. But it's different than, say, Locke, for example, because Locke says that the just winner against an unjust aggressor can only take so much land that is necessary to pay back the cost incurred in the war. And why is that? Because the children of the unjust aggressor have a right to inherit their father's property, which Jefferson seems to deny here, right? So it's an important feature of the claim. But this is a condensed version, roughly about the same number of words as the key passage of the Declaration of Independence I'll mention, the second paragraph. It's a condensation of the sprawling letter to James Madison he writes from Paris in 1789, which he hand delivers in January 1790, in which he gives this argument, in which he also says that no constitution can last longer than a generation, that any constitution that lasts longer than a generation exists by force and not by right.
This we say on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.